Hello everyone, I'm Robin Shuckburgh and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. It seems extraordinary, but it's now 5 years since we started filming in the Cotswolds to bring you an insight into our favourite part of England. To celebrate this anniversary, I've decided this week to bring you a small selection of highlights from our series exploring the Cotswolds. A personal selection that brings especially warm memories for me. They're only snippets, but the joy of YouTube is that it's always possible, should you wish to do so, to go back to the original films and watch the whole story. The first memory I've chosen is from episode 1 of Exploring the Cotswolds. It's Broughton Castle. 3 miles southwest of Banbury. It was the first time we'd asked permission from the owners of the building to use the drone to film on their land. They were the first in a long line of helpful and cooperative landowners. It's also the house of Viola de Lesseps in Shakespeare in Love, my all-time favourite movie, which I watched for the umpteenth time only last night. Broughton Castle.
We're heading north now to visit the village of Broughton, where lurks one of the most spectacular buildings in the county. Broughton Castle is the home of the Fiennes family, lords of Say and Seal. In the 15th century, William Fiennes, the second Baron Say and Seal, married the great-great-granddaughter of the sister of the founder of New College, Oxford, William of Wykeham. She brought the castle with her. William's father, the first Baron, was the unpopular Lord Say in Shakespeare's Henry VI, who was beheaded by Jack Cade. During the Civil War, the Fiennes family was strongly parliamentarian, and they raised a small army known as Lord Say's Bluecoats, who did good service at the Battle of Edgehill, but surrendered to the king shortly afterwards. There is a room at the top of the castle still known as the barracks, where the soldiers were billeted. Broughton illustrates clearly the effect of the 20th century. Evans wrote in 1905, "Besides the castle and the rectory, there are only some half-dozen scattered houses to be seen." These days, the population of Broughton is 1,700 souls.
Travelling west from Broughton, in episode 2, we came to the amazingly steep escarpment of the Cotswold and peered over the edge to see the battleground of Edgehill, the very first pitched battle of the Civil War. It was a spooky place with ghosts at every turn, but also the place where Richard Shuckburgh, an ancestor of mine, received a knighthood the evening before the battle. Now there's a good connection.
This extraordinary steep slope is the site of the first major pitched battle in the Civil War. War had been declared for some time before this battle, but the two armies had yet to meet. They were marching towards one another, the royalists from Warwick towards London, and Essex, in charge of the parliamentarian army, moving to intercept him. It's really difficult to imagine this in our modern day and age when communications are so good, but they really didn't know where they were or where each of their opponent was. And it wasn't until the two quartermasters for these two armies, searching for billets and food in the villages behind me here, bumped into one another and with much consternation realized that the two armies must be very, very close. They raced back to their respective bosses and warned them that a battle was imminent. The royalists gathered on the top of this ridge where there were no trees in those days, so it was a bare hill, and the parliamentarians in the valley below. Not surprisingly, the parliamentarians had no wish to try and attack the royalist army up this incredibly steep slope, and so it would have been a stalemate. It's possible Charles could have headed for London at that moment, but he decided not to because he was feared that he might arrive in London with a hostile reception and the army at his back. So he felt a confrontation was inevitable. He moved his soldiers off the hill, down into the valley, and they lined up on the 23rd of October for the first pitched battle of the war. So here we are, we're standing on the ridge, on the side of the ridge here of Edgehill, with the hill behind us, looking out over this extraordinary valley. And right here is the church farm. You can see the church about 700 or 800 yards in that direction. And then beyond that, in the flat fields of this extraordinary valley we're looking out over, is where the armies drew up in front of one another for their battle. It must have been the most extraordinary sight and noise. Nearly 12,000 men on each side, a lot of artillery, pikes and swordsmanship. It must have been the most remarkable sight for those people standing on this ridge.
The battle started at 3:30 in the afternoon on Sunday the 23rd of October 1642. Neither army was particularly experienced, so it took them some hours to get themselves ready for conflict. The Parliamentarian army numbered around 12,500, and the Royalists a few hundred more, and the king, dressed in black velvet lined with ermine, rode through the ranks of his army, encouraging them to give of their best. His nephew, Prince Rupert, was in command of his cavalry and was to play a key part in the battle, which started with a huge bombardment, fairly ineffectually, but very frightening. Then Rupert's cavalry charged across the valley to engage his Parliamentarian opposite numbers, scattering them and causing them to flee. At this stage it would have been sensible for him to return to the battlefield to support the rest of the Royalist army, and if he had done so, it's quite possible that the day would have been won and the whole history of England would have been very different. Instead, Rupert followed the fleeing Parliamentarians, came across their baggage train, and decided to allow his men to loot and plunder. And by the time he returned, the battle had swung in the Parliamentarians' favour. Whilst his later contribution did make the battle end in a draw, it deprived the king of victory. In the morning, exhausted by their efforts the previous day, both armies retired from the battlefield. The king to Banbury, where he was to capture the castle and create a lasting stronghold, and the Earl of Essex to London, where he set up defences which made it impossible for the king ever to capture the capital.
This place really is quite extraordinary. It's so atmospheric. You really can imagine what it must have been like with those great armies out on the fields out there.
Moving south a little, my next memory is from episode 3 of Exploring the Cotswolds, Hales Abbey. I don't think I'd really understood the scale of the rampant vandalism resulting from the Reformation until I saw Hales Abbey. It's a truly haunting place, and as I know I am fond of saying, well worth a visit. I also know that Ross won't be able to resist putting in some footage of the amazing steam railway which runs within half a mile of Hales.
Descending from Farmcote through the wood, we find ourselves in a green coombe, shut in by hills on all sides except the north. On our right is the parish church. In the meadow on our left, a square plot enclosed by 4 ruined walls. This is the cloister garth of the once famous Cistercian monastery of Hales. Nothing else remains. The splendid church, the conventual buildings, the approaches, the gatehouse, the precinct walls, all have gone. There is nothing above ground but these ruined walls to tell of the vast edifice of which they once formed so small a part. A few years would suffice for the destruction of all that for 3 centuries had been the object of veneration. Neither here nor at Winchcombe, 2 miles away, was it any outburst of popular fanaticism or any violent manifestation of popular hostility that overthrew the shrines and pulled down the walls of these 2 magnificent churches. The demolition was deliberate and systematic. It was a mere matter of business proceeding upon a cool calculation of profit and loss. That these buildings were landmarks in the history of the national church, that they were the supreme efforts of constructive art, was quite beside the question. It was enough that on utilitarian grounds they stood condemned. Neither of them was needed, either for a cathedral, as at Gloucester, or for a parish church, as at Tewkesbury. Why then should they any longer cumber the ground? Rather let them be swept away at once, and their materials put to some more profitable use. So, at any rate, thought the man who was responsible for their destruction. Thomas, Lord Seymour of Sudeley, Lord High Admiral of England, and brother-in-law of the King. Both abbeys had been granted to him at the dissolution in 1539, and he was not the man to lose any time in making the most of his acquisition. It would no doubt be unfair to condemn him on this count alone. 9 out of 10 men in his day, estimable citizens enough according to their lights, would have done the same, but for Thomas Seymour it is impossible on any count to feel either sympathy or respect. So thoroughly were his orders in each case carried out that not a single stone of either church remains, and it has been only in recent years that excavations have discovered their foundations and given us indisputable evidence of their former splendour. The small parish church of Hales stands close beside the abbey. Originally built in the 12th century, it passed on the foundation of the monastery into the possession of the monks, and was much altered by them. The fragments of the original church which remain are the shafts of the chancel arch and the 2 pilasters which support the south chancel wall. The site is now looked after by English Heritage, who have a fascinating visitor centre where you can find out in detail about the remarkable history of the building and wander the cloisters, imagining yourself overawed by the beauty of what used to be.
Next, in episode 5, we head to the Slad Valley. When I was a young man, I was introduced to Laurie Lee, and I remember the weird feeling of trying, quite unsuccessfully, to imagine this rather intimidating man writing the iconic book Cider with Rosie. It did nothing, however, to change my mind that this book was, for that young man at least, truly life-changing. It's lovely to read a little bit of it aloud.
I was set down from the carrier's cart at the age of 3, and there, with a sense of bewilderment and terror, my life in the village began. The June grass amongst which I stood was taller than I was, and I wept. I'd never been so close to grass before. It towered above me and all around me, each blade tattooed with tiger skins of sunlight. It was knife-edged, dark, and a wicked green, thick as a forest, and alive with grasshoppers that chirped and chattered and leapt through the air like monkeys. So wrote Laurie Lee at the start of his autobiographical book, Cider with Rosie. This book, a description of what it was like to grow up in a small country village at the end of the First World War, formed, for many of my generation, and indeed subsequent generations, part of our own childhoods. A romanticised description of life, but one so astute and perceptive that no one reading this book could fail to glean some improved understanding of the human condition. Rescued by his sisters from the long grass, Lee continues, "That was the day we came to the village, in the summer of the last year of the First World War, to a cottage that stood in a half-acre of garden on a steep bank above a lake. A cottage with 3 floors and a cellar, and a treasure in the walls, with a pump and apple trees, syringa and strawberries, rooks in the chimneys, frogs in the cellar, mushrooms on the ceiling, and all for 3 and 6pence a week." As you can see, the beauty of this village remains almost completely unspoiled. It's a rare survival of a small valley community close to the industrial heart of the early wool industry that stands as an incredible reminder of a simpler time. And yet, even here, the developer has threatened. Over the last 10 years, the Slad Valley people and their supporters have fought off attempts to develop on the land in between here and Stroud. So far they've been successful, but we know how persistent these developers are, and there is no room for complacency. Whilst it's perfectly clear that we as a nation have failed our population drastically by not ensuring enough homes were built in the past, it is absolutely vital we don't allow this terrible failure to engender an even greater catastrophe, the devastation of the very thing that makes people want to live and work in this beautiful country. Our plans to make short films on the villages of this wonderful region, somewhere between documentary and travelogue, have changed just a little. We find ourselves trying instead to chronicle the potential ruination of the Cotswolds, and just possibly, with your help, to put a brake on the destructive forces of greed that threaten them.
Finally, in episode 7, we discovered the utterly amazing Church of St. Nicholas at Oddington. Of all the hundreds of treasures we've found in the wonderful Cotswolds, Oddington stands out for me as perhaps the most remarkable. I'm sure we'll find others as we continue our travels, but for now, this is my pick of the memories.
The village of Oddington is certainly a gem on its own, but follow the signs for the Church of St. Nicholas for a treat that is truly memorable. Evans, our familiar travel companion, writes of this church.
Shortly after leaving Addlestrop Bridge, we may digress half a mile as far as the old church of Oddington. This very interesting church now stands in solitary grandeur, hard by a coppice tenanted by rooks and quite deserted by the village, which long ago migrated up the hill to a spot nearer the common fields. Here a new church has been built, and except for an occasional funeral, the silence of the old church is seldom disturbed. We, who have purposely left our road to seek it out in its seclusion, may be counted among its disturbers. Happier, they who in an April stroll by the Evenlode through meadow and spinney, bright with marigolds and primroses, burst upon it unexpectedly and stand fettered by the sudden spell. There's nothing to mar the quiet beauty of chancel, nave, aisle and tower. Nothing but the cawing of the rooks to break the silence. That aisle, once the nave of a small Norman church of the common Cotswold type, received later the tower at its eastern end, and then, in the prosperous times of the early Edwards, the new nave and chancel arose, and ever since it has been but the side aisle of the larger church.
What he didn't know, writing as he was in 1905, was that hidden under the whitewash on the north wall of the nave was one of the most complete depictions of the doom of mankind existing in this country today. Painted in 1340, probably whitewashed before it could be destroyed at the beginning of the Reformation, uncovered in 1913 and fully restored in the 1970s, the beauty of this wall painting reduced both Ross and me to speechlessness. I quote from the excellent leaflet in the church. At the top centre of the painting is a figure of Jesus, flanked by apostles and saints, and below this are two angels sounding a trumpet to awaken the dead. The bottom of the image shows the dead rising from their graves to be judged. Some are awaiting admittance to the gates of heaven, while others are being dragged into hell, where the fearsome figure of Satan, surrounded with his imps, awaits them. It is a truly remarkable survivor from medieval times, and is, most certainly, my gem of the month. The church relies on donations from visitors for its survival, so do visit and remember to leave something in the box.
So here's to another 5 years of this exciting journey. And here's to you, the thousands of you who make the whole thing worthwhile. Many, many thanks. We've many interesting things planned for the next few months, so please keep watching. But until next week, goodbye.